that Taco John's that I always talk about. It's on the way to my daughter's school, and they've always got the special out there. And for the last like 3 weeks, it's been flaming hot breakfast Cheeto burrito. Can you imagine? I mean, think about that for breakfast. So I'll be driving through it. I'll be driving by. I'm like, who's up for a Cheeto burrito?
Is it flaming hot on the way in or the way out?
You hear that out there?
Just restart.
To me, this whole concept of the great inversion, the idea that now all of a sudden we're going to reverse white flight, suburbs, people are going to move into the city, is really simplistic. It's simplistic, and to me it's almost like baby boomer simplistic, like the notion that, well, you know, after World War II we just picked up and moved out to the edge, and now we're just picking up and moving back in. And to me, I see so much more complexity in terms of this migration than what that term just captures.
I think you're right, there's a lot of complexity built up in that process, but what's interesting to me, because we all travel around a lot, is that I'm seeing the quote-unquote great inversion, as the author Alan Ehrenholt calls it, or coined the phrase, playing out differently everywhere. In a lot of places it's not happening at all.
Right.
In some places, as you can go to like downtown Raleigh, that's a city that's booming. There's just so much going on with young people and new jobs and tech sector and new investment happening, where you can kind of see that starting to take shape. The question, I think, with the great inversion, at least with the millennial demographic, is how does that play out in the next decade? Right. Now that it's really kind of underway and we don't really know.
I think it's interesting though, we're bringing all that suburban stuff like back into the downtown. We're trying to fit it all though. So everything that we learned wrong, and there's stuffing in this area. And I think,
how do we get the drive-through downtown?
That's right, yeah. And so it's kind of sad to see, it's this hybrid. We're living in this bizarre hybrid time, and it's just nothing.
I think it's a hybrid because we've got so many people our age who grew up in the suburbs, and then they want urban living. They want walkability, but they still want some of the amenities of suburban living, and so you're getting that.
But don't you notice the interesting thing is like this whole movement for like public-private partnerships to create parking garages now. And there's this idea that we don't like transit, or we get upset with public transit because it's easy to pick on because of the cost. But do we not realize that we're just now, we've given everybody their own personal streetcar, and then all the private will say we will take on by creating our own trolley barns for everybody at all of your locations. So it's an interesting kind of interplay, because look at these old pictures and all, you just don't see these. If you would have shown people 100 years ago parking garage facilities that just dot downtown, like, what are these things?
Especially here in Buffalo, what are they doing?
In Buffalo they have 27 football fields of public parking.
Joe, is that enough?
I don't know, it can get up to 30.
Well, you were saying yesterday, you failed when the first floor of your parking garage is empty. And like walking around here yesterday, it was like all like that.
Well, you started earlier with this whole kind of notion of it's a simple change in the inversion. We all see that it's much more complex. How many times have we been in presentations and somebody asks us for a standard, or what's the magic number, or how do I follow a prescriptive formula? What you guys do, this kind of very active and engaged kind of thing. And we keep on searching for these simple solutions to a very messy world.
It's messy. Well, and to me, I feel like there's, and I don't want to make this all generational, but there's a certain amount of, we're trying to have the drive-through in the downtown because we realize that we need to have more downtown, and there's more of a demand for that, but yet the people making a lot of the decisions can't visualize a world where they can't drive 2 blocks to the next place and park out in front of it. And I feel like that's a little bit, at least when I run into the resistance, there's a big generational component to it in terms of the market desire versus the regulatory framework and the decision making. That's
the push and pull between, the tension gets created between the cities that we want and the cities that get delivered. And that's what's really kind of rubbing and driving, I think, a lot of the Better Block tactical urbanism discussion or projects, is that people are constantly rubbing up and hitting against that.
The mayor came out, and when he was running to be mayor of Dallas at the time, and he came to our little historic district that we have called the Bishop Arts District. He's like, this place is great, but you know what, the 2 things it could use a Potbellies This is a place with like 30 local businesses. Yeah, and more parking. And I thought, it's interesting because this place is packed and it's working.
Right.
And the only way we're going to get more parking in here is if we tear down one of the historic buildings to make it so we can fit that parking, but it's going to make it less the place you like in the first place.
You could use a Dunkin' Donuts and, because it's such a hip, cool place.
Yeah. I think it's interesting though, just this counterintuitive idea process that we have to keep telling people. And I'm a business owner. I own a little restaurant in Dallas, and I have to tell people as the business owner, no, take away my parking, make this place more irresistible for people because people will park further. If you create more amenities that give them an excuse to walk. So that is the hardest concept for some reason
and yet I think a lot of urbanists use this anecdote, how willing are people to park at the very edge of the mall parking lot, walk in, and then walk for an hour and a half around the mall constantly. But there's this huge cognitive dissonance between the environment and why they're walking and the parking that should be so easy. It's like the active parking has to be made as easy as possible.
I'll go a little meta here for a second. It's to some extent it's the problem of modernism, that that you can sanitize things down to formulas, that you can go to the architecture. Let's just strip off everything and abstract the building. If it's a window, it's just a window. It's a box, it's just a box, right? But we have the same process and policy that they want standards and rules and whatever. If you go out Elmwood, this neighborhood here in Buffalo, it's these houses. We were sitting in the restaurant eating, and then all of a sudden we're just like, hey, wait a minute, this is a little weird. And we realized we were sitting in what used to be the living room, and there was a step down going forward, and it was basically what used to be the front porch. They glommed on appended this commercial building onto the face of the house. And you see this all around Buffalo, this incremental growth that happened. What was the tipping point at which that neighborhood became too dense? And then all of a sudden somebody's like, well, there's lots of people walking around, let's just glom on some commercial. Could you imagine making a zoning code that would allow that? Neighborhood association.
People would freak out.
I was doing a presentation last night, and during the Q&A, somebody from that neighborhood started talking about the fact that there was buildings out of context coming into that neighborhood that were greater than 4 stories tall. And I was like, dude, have you walked around your own neighborhood? There's like 12-story buildings in the middle of your neighborhood.
Come on.
So it's, I think we've kind of simplified and sanitized all of our processes again, going back to that modern movement, I think that it's where Euclidean zoning comes from. It's just, how do we make basic rules, and let's just we're going to just detach ourselves from creative thought and let other things
contextual thought.
Well, and the other issue that I hear, and you guys know this, and what are your thoughts on this? Like I've been told we all understand these concepts now, especially through the tactical urbanism, and we want these things, but the banking won't allow us for those models. I mean, is that the real problem?
No, I think that is obviously a huge obstacle, but I kind of look at that too as part and parcel of the generational obstacle. Back in the 1940s, 1950s, when we wanted to start building suburbia, we did it. And when the rules got in the way, we changed the rules. And when the financing wasn't adequate, we changed the financing. Today, we have all these things in place that a certain strata of our society is kind of set up to benefit from, operate within. It's a system that they're comfortable with because there's a certain amount of power and wealth that accrues within that system. So changing that becomes much, much harder. And I almost feel like we've got to get the finance more local before some of those larger systematic changes will occur.
In that way, it's remarkable how much redevelopment, neighborhood activation has occurred in spite of the system that's in making a barrier of that.
But you look at these old buildings in and around Buffalo, they weren't built with a pension fund out of California. How did they have that wealth? The Guarantee Building is worth $26 million an acre of value, and it's been here since 1896. It's unbelievable potency in this stuff. But the financing industry, it has its own dumbness to it too. I worked in real estate finance and sit there with the asset managers and show them 2 buildings and say, this is a Class A office building in Topeka, this is a Class A office building in Tacoma. And they were the same damn building, just dropped in 2 different suburbs. And they were actually performing really poorly, but for them it was a Class A. It met all of their standard of what they thought a Class A building was.
They could fit it into, and this is kind of the dumb finance problem we have right now, is that if you can fit it into an asset class, you can bundle it, securitize it, sell it off on a secondary market, and generate all kinds of liquidity, all kinds of money for it, they're not high returning transactions.
Right.
You know, they're not transactions that hold their value. They're not even transactions that pay for the developer ultimately.
They're not even plugged in and rooted into the community.
Right.
I mean, you're talking about entrepreneurial, building a grassroots, people that aren't going to leave. You're not going to pick up your restaurant and move to
your Potbelly, right?
That's right, exactly, like Potbelly. Yeah.
You know,
you're rooted at this point.
Right. But the way it's financed kind of lends itself to that more transactional.
But that's what's so exciting about what's happening in urbanism and entrepreneurship today, is that we're figuring out ways, not at the massive national, you know, asset level, class level, to figure this out, funding these projects, but at the neighborhood level, we've got crowdfunding and resourcing tools, whether it's IOBI or Brickstarter or whatever, that's figuring out how to match the capital to the entrepreneurs to really activate the smaller buildings to get this stuff going again. And I don't know how that continues to scale and how far it goes until it really rubs up against a scale issue, but I think it's really interesting that it's happening. People are working on a different model to just ignore that system.
Right.
That system doesn't work for them.
Right.
Well, and yeah, it's born out of necessities. It's this innovation that comes from the shared economy now that we actually have more options because we can share. I think, you know, I told an anecdote you guys may have heard earlier today in our session about, I thought it was amazing, you know, the story of Napoleon, whenever he was brought to the Isle of Elba, the first time, he was exiled twice. The first island he was sent to, though, he was given sovereignty over this island of 12,000 people. And so you give a guy who was an emperor a sovereignty over an island, what he does is he organizes them, he gets the iron mining going again, gets the resources happening, he fixes the education system, and fixes the farming methods, and then he creates an army and a navy, and he gets himself off the island to become emperor of France again.
Right.
So it's like organizing these resources around you in your community in order to like make great things. I mean, and that's what I think is fascinating about all these movements we're talking about. It doesn't take a lot of people, but that's what I think is the next movement, is how do we identify what we have, the broken systems in our places, and reutilize them and put them basically into use, into getting us off the island and back into like a productive society again.
More George.
More George, yeah. How much of this is a big government, little government thing? Because so often we try to, you know, we have people contact Strong Towns and try to draw us into this, you know, left-right government paradigm debate we're having today. And I just reflexively like don't see the world in that way anymore. I kind of see it as, you know, good government and you know, government that isn't as helpful. And, you know, at the local level, I feel like there's a lot of things that don't work, but there's a lot of things that do, and that you can make some changes there.
Right. So that's complexity, right? So you're willing to engage complexity, whereas most people want to think big, small, left, right, in those paradigms, and that's what's very challenging about having real discussions about how do you reform systems and government.
Yeah, are you for more government or less?
Better government.
Yeah.
Better government. We're not going to get rid of government. I love better government.
And I think where better government works really well too, I found even with our streetcar project, we were told if we wanted a streetcar, it'd take years and takes, you know, 3 times as much money as we actually ended up needing for our project. They got really innovative when we gave them this, like, oh, you got 3 years to get this done because we have these federal dollars coming in, or else the money goes away. And it was amazing how efficient they got and how they just started stripping away their own bureaucracy. And you compare this to like a military, how we are in the Army, like Patton, he goes in and he says in World War II, like, look, I got to get across this river here, and I'm going to do it like in 2 days, regardless. And they're like, well, we don't have time to kind of sit and contemplate and come up with how is the funding mechanism, how's it going to work. It's like, I'm getting over there.
You do it.
We're getting over. And if somebody came up and gave him a process-heavy thing, he'd be like, fire that guy. Give me somebody who can do this. And that's what happens with the government. It can get efficient, I think, whenever you give it these short deadlines and tell it to act.
Well, sometimes they just fear change. They haven't tried something different. They're like, oh, well, we've got this process. We've got to fit our other process on this process. It's like, why is that necessary?
But these places, and that's what's amazing to me, are on like life support. So
It's
like,
Your system's not working so well. So.
Well, Andrew Brotherson had a great insight to me. He talked about government, how when businesses are starved for resources, they cut staff and they keep programs. And when governments become starved for resources, they cut programs and they keep staff. And it seems to me like today, I mean, and I know a lot of people that work with government. They're wonderful people. They work hard. They're conscientious. I really don't think you have, you know, the lazy government employees. I mean, I've not run into them, not in any greater numbers than you run into in private practice.
Sure, absolutely.
But what you have is a system that is kind of calcified. and it almost takes the patent to stand up and say, damn it, we're going over this river, to like break all that loose.
That's the lesson of Jeanette Siddiq-Khan in New York City.
Yeah.
She was our patent. She came in and said, this is BS, the system's not working for us, we need to innovate on our streets, and she was able to figure that out. And I think that's what, I mean, you're not going to get a Jeanette Siddiq-Khan in every single city, but that does help when that leadership is there to direct that action. Because then everyone else will just fall into line.
Right.
Yeah, an individual can make a difference.
Big difference.
In a community. This Nancy Graham in West Palm Beach, Joe Riley in Charleston.
Absolutely.
You see these individuals. It is kind of rare, unfortunately. Sometimes in government you also see these fits and misfits.
Right.
And good people, but in the totally wrong location.
Right.
So they're taking their fear because they're really not trained in this practice to understand this stuff. So they freak out. They don't want to have the risk of their neck on the chopping block.
Right.
And that's hard. I mean, think that I always throw the number of the value of cities. You know, Buffalo's worth $6 billion or something like that. So that's like there's 7 times the Buffalo Bills value.
Right.
You know, and so I do that just to kind of get them in the mindset of understanding, yes, this is complex. These are complex systems. $1 billion for the town of Niagara Falls is a huge number.
It's a lot of money.
So how do you manage that? You know, this is a complex thing, but you got to get into it creatively, willingly, to uncover this kind of stuff.
How can we make that? How can we make those cities work more? That's a big question.
Right.
Could you imagine I mean, I just throw the finance word out there, but just to go out as an investor, like your restaurant, I don't want to make more money in the future. I just want to just keep the course.
Yeah. Right.
You know, it's like, no, you want to sell more. You want to give your employees a raise. You want to do things.
Not only that, but run your restaurant not knowing how much the building is worth, how much your staff is actually, you know, going to get paid, what it costs to prepare a meal, you know, how many meals you've committed to do. It's I look at like people who invest in government bonds, and I'm like, I could never buy a government bond. I look at like even if they have this great track record of always being paid, it's always being paid because the tide has been rising, not because there's any sound finance behind any of it, because it's insane. It's really crazy.
The work that you guys have brought to my attention the last 3 years has been exactly that, how we've been really behind the wheel, not just asleep for 40 years, but I knew that part, but blind too. You know, the fact that we haven't really woken up and seen what are the results of our systems and actually measured that.
We've been so rich we haven't had to ask the question.
Unbelievable.
Well, it's funny because I had lunch with our city manager in Dallas the other day, and he knows nothing about urbanism or anything, but he's realizing just by looking at the numbers now, since we annexed so much of our city and things like that, he's like, I can't keep paying for these streets anymore. He's like, I'm gonna, and he said publicly, I need to start selling off streets.
Right.
So he's coming to this equation naturally on his own, and he said he took a trip.
I thought streets made us wealthy.
Yeah. He went to Austria recently, and he's like, the 3 to 4 story building is ideal. And he started talking about how that works and how well it works.
Yeah.
That's what's curious to me, though. Why? You know, and then especially in my community in Dallas, where we tout this business-friendly kind of initiative. Why has that not translated into the ethos of kind of the business community, or just kind of overall? Why is that? Why is Portland, which looks like I would think would be the Bohemian Central, more of an innovator on the business side of the equation, I think, than places like Dallas?
In Memphis, I had a chance to meet with the Chamber of Commerce. I can't remember what they called themselves. It was some group.
Champion Circle.
Yeah, and everyone in there had given a huge amount of money to this thing to drive changes in innovation in Memphis. And I went and met with them, and it was like the first time that I was with a chamber group where they actually got it, where it got beyond how do we subsidize the next business to come here, how do we build the next freeway interchange, how do we follow in the paradigm. And it was, at one hand, invigorating because you saw people get it. On the other hand, it was really scary because you realize this is every community in the country has like their merchant class, which is our version of the merchant class, which 100 years ago used to be the curmudgeonly old guys going, we don't want to build that waterworks, because then we don't have the money, right? And now they are a completely different ethos, a completely different mindset. I do think that there's a lot of change that needs to come from that strata of leaders in our community.
Well, they just need they're I hate the word, you use the word legitimize, but they can legitimize action. They can remove the risk, because there's a lot of people that work in government, that's been their only job, is working in government. How the private sector operates is kind of freaky to them.
Right.
So not to overly cartoon it, but it's just, I've worked in both government and private sector, and I've just seen it on both sides of the fence. People in the private sector is like, oh, is government always get in the way? Right. And then you just ask them, have you ever worked in government? I mean, I was accused of destroying people's lives every single day on the job. I couldn't imagine poor people in work in government have a hard job, but it's...
Right, I think the challenge is that when you're working in government, whether you are 22 and you just get hired, or you're 62 and about to retire, let's be honest, 72 and about to retire now.
Right.
You're working within the weight of a system that was designed for another era. Right. So how can we take even just one piece of that, let's just call it the planning department, and get that queued up to deal with a new era and a new challenge and new issues that we all see every day as private citizens, that either new ideas, new innovations, new products, new whatever it might be, that is changing how we live our lives daily, and yet we have a system that largely was put into place in 1941 in Dallas is when your zoning's from. LA is just updating their zoning from 70 years ago. Philadelphia just did. Like on down the line, you see major American cities are being managed, and the growth is being created through a system from the Leave It to Beaver era.
Actually, that's a great point. And you think about what form-based code as a word kind of reared its head in the 90s. And here it is commonplace for cities to just say, okay, let's just take our zoning code and just do something different with it. So there is a success there, a success story to honor that governments can change. Pretty significant stuff. Take their whole operating system and go, we're going to go from DOS to Apple, like just new computer. And not to say that that's a panacea, but at least it shows you that governments can change their skeleton.
I hadn't heard that number. Did you hear that Tommy said today? I thought was fascinating that cities are, in Memphis at least specifically, to get these big employers in, are spending what, $150,000 per job
that comes in.
Oh yeah.
And so our metric there is job growth for cities. Like why have we not figured that out?
Yeah, job growth is such a bizarre. To me, it's like a metric of desperation, because you're in an ideal system, you've got a productive place that is churning along, creating jobs, indifferent to what the local government is doing. You know what I'm saying? Like a really good place creates jobs. A really successful economy distributes wealth naturally, right? Because there's opportunities being created and things. And to me, the whole dysfunction of the fact that you have to spend $150,000 to get a job, that we have these huge gaps in wealth and income, is a byproduct of the fact that the macroeconomy just doesn't, it doesn't work. And at the city level, you might be able to look at national metrics, GDP growth, unemployment, what have you, but when you get down into the trenches in the local level, you can see how it just is dysfunctional, it's just distorted.
And I think it's fascinating too, is just that this, I guess we talk about this economic gardening model, is that's what cities are looking at now, or thinking about now, as opposed to economic harvesting. Because when I sit into these meetings talking to people about what do you want in your community, you won't believe how often I'll hear, like, we want a Chipotle. And I'll sit there and think, how hard is it to make
a Chick-fil-A?
How hard is it to make a burrito? And like, we have enough unemployed people or creative people in this community that we can probably assemble a burrito together and potentially compete with Chipotle and make a better model. So it's not, the thing is, but we would actually, as a city, say, well, this is what you want as a community. We'll get on airplanes with our people. I'll go try to find incentives to bring them out here, and then they'll drop in their their prepackaged thing. As opposed to what we're saying is, like, actually spend maybe a tenth of that locally and do a pop-up for 6 weeks and just see if this burritos work here. And in the end, you might have a local
Dunkin' Donuts. We don't have Dunkin' Donuts in Minnesota, right? They're now opening 50 stores statewide. Front page of the newspaper, the statewide newspaper. It was like a huge deal. I started looking into this. Donut shops are something that when you think about a local entrepreneur filling a gap, a donut shop should be a pretty basic thing to start up, right? You got a deep fryer, you got some whatever, and it's not like a high overhead kind of business, right? To start a Dunkin' Donuts, you have to have a $500,000 net worth and $250,000 of liquid net worth in order to apply to have a franchise. Wow. You wonder why we have this gap between income classes, because we have taken the entrepreneur, the person who could have started the donut shop 50 years ago, and now said your highest aspiration is to be the night manager at the Dunkin' Donuts. all that wealth is going to be mined and sucked out of the community.
Totally.
Yeah.
And all you're there to do is just basically fulfill that franchisee model.
Right, when you show your picture of Brainerd in the early 1900s,
right.
It's this incredible environment of activity and 3 and 4 stories, like all the new buildings are there, and you don't have one Chipotle or one Dunkin' Donuts. You know, the wealth is being circulated within the community, not being exported out.
So that's an interesting thing that we're seeing now, though, with these chains and all coming into, they're bombarding these areas that do start to kind of get fixed, and they end up suffocating the place eventually on its own. So that's where I think that the need for that quality of public space is needed, because that way you can actually program these areas. And we're having this battle where people, at least in my community, where they're saying, you know, we don't need public spaces because it's too costly and nobody supports them. Let's just sell it over to the private, and of course the private's going to take it, and we're going to get our Dunkin' Donuts out of it. And that has its own series of issues that we face with. But the interesting thing about public spaces is there's an opportunity for us to continue to innovate, small with little tiny pop-ups and things like that. And so it's sad for me to see this reclamation of all these areas and just kind of being given over.
Well, there's a lesson in the urban design in all of this. You know, that I mean, I'll use Miami as the example. That Coconut Grove, Miami Beach, and Coral Gables blew up, went crazy. You know, back when I went to school there, they were kind of edgy a little bit. Now they're the highest priced stuff. There's chains have moved into everything, and it's because of the lack of other types of physical environments that are like that.
Exactly.
You know, if all of Miami were designed like those 3 places, the entrepreneurs can still move around. If they're priced out of one district with a square and public space and all that stuff, they just go to the next one. We're seeing that in Nashville. Downtown's too explosive. So the other neighborhoods, the fabric is still there. They're just moving into those areas, and the entrepreneurs are still able to get the low rents because we've got supply. This town's a perfect example here in Buffalo. There's plenty of real estate to move into. But the problem that they have is everybody just keeps on moving onto the one spine of Elmwood Street. So how do you replicate that in the less well-off neighborhoods that still have the entrepreneurial spirit? They just don't have the density, and the problem with Buffalo is they blew out too much of their real estate. At least these folks are conscious of the mistakes.
You see that in hyper speed, warp speed in Manhattan and now in Brooklyn and elsewhere in New York City. But the thing that saves the metropolitan region from the hyper gentrification is that we've got such a massive supply of walkable urbanism on train lines that people just want to be a part of, they want to invest in. If they can't afford, you know, neighborhood A, they can go to neighborhood D, and that neighborhood is already kind of turned on and happening, and already the prices are lower. So you have options. I mean, I don't know what we do in 50 years, but you know, at least there's the supply is there. And a lot of smaller cities and smaller towns, when those few neighborhoods get activated and done, then they get, you know, bought up by the chains. Oftentimes there's nowhere else to go.
Yeah, that's it.
You know, and oftentimes there's neighborhoods, and I find this a lot in the work that we do in different places, is that the neighborhood that gets switched on becomes this really active area. In fact, we were just working in Oklahoma City, and there's basically 2 neighborhoods that have been switched back on that are really active now. And all of the locals and people who help generate all that activity are now upset because everybody from outside the region drives in on a Saturday night and takes over.
That's what takes over happened to you.
But they don't have anywhere else to go. There's no other walkable.
Have you guys heard that? There's a great Warren Buffett quote about the cycle of good ideas, and he said this happens. And this guy's 80 yeyears old, the Oracle of Omaha, and he says this happens in every good idea. It starts with innovators, then you get imitators, and then idiots in the end. And so that's surely what we're seeing in these places. It's just like we all. And like you said, that's the answer to the gentrification question, I think, as well. Like when people say, well, should you stop doing these things? Like, no, you need thousands of these places. So it's a supply and demand issue. Let's lower that, the demand, or raise the supply at least.
But then you get back to our financing, regulatory structures, both government and private sides, and you realize that how that does not align at all with the kinds of places we need to create. And so the places that we do create wind up being so expensive. An affordable housing unit in San Francisco or Brooklyn's heroic.
I get it,
but the demand is so strong to be in those places.
And that's what I hear that, like the gentrification argument, and to me, gentrification is almost like the necessary evil in many cases of doing things well. And I've always felt like the answer is just do more great places well. Like, why have just one place that works? Why not export this to every neighborhood and essentially meet that demand?
I think the reality of doing that is that if you don't have that physical fabric and it hasn't been there for 50, 60, 70 years, we only have so many places intact that are like that. So to create a whole cloth, is to get a whole new neighborhood, call it new urbanism, and that has a value and it can be much better than alternatives, but it still doesn't feel like the stuff that has the patina and the age and the authenticity. So it's, we can only deliver the answer at the scale of 80 acres. And that's a problem, because when we delivered these neighborhoods historically, we did it at the scale of 8 lots, a lot, at a time, as opposed to 100 acres at a time.
Right, and that's a different developer.
A lot different kind of.
It's a different developer. It's a different financing model. It's a different local regulatory model. Right. I mean, this is where I see like all of these different places. I love CNU. Because CNU is a gathering of all these different people pushing on the same wall, right? Mm-hmm. When I look back at the whole suburban experiment, the whole post-World War II, emptying out of the cities, there was no pattern, there was no like centralized organizing force that lined all these places up. They just all lined up. Mm-hmm. And I'm waiting for that coalesce, all these just coalesce and just push on the wall at the same time in the same place and bust through it. Because there's all these different hurdles and obstacles we've got to overcome, and all these different interests that I think are like desiring to do that.
Yeah, I think here's the opportunity and the possibility for us too, though. I was in Munich speaking, and they of course already had great form and great buildings and great public spaces, but when they heard me speak and they talked, their problem is now they have issues with community engagement, some of the things we face too. But after they saw some of the projects we were doing and some of the other projects going around the nation, they were like, the US will actually take this and you'll see dramatic change probably in 10 or 20 years. I mean, we're thinking 100 years, but it's amazing how fast as a nation I think that we do take an idea and rapidly, in 10 years, like I said, nobody was talking about Portland in 1985, but 20 years later, it's like Portland's the thing. They said think about China, right? They said China will take 100 years to come out of the dark ages, and they pretty much make everything we have. Yeah, it's true.
What do you tell a group in Munich? Because I mean, I've seen you go over there, and I'm like, how do you, because in a sense, if you've all, I mean, everybody here has been overseas. What we look at is like great, like the Bishop Arts District, such an awesome place. It would be such a nondescript thing over there. Like it would be like, that's the.
It's interesting. From when I said the same thing. Like, why am I here? And they're like, their problems. They're like, well, our government pays, gives us money for anything we want to do. I'm like, well, what are you complaining about? But they said that their problem is they lack innovation. They lack. They lack people coming in and pushing the boundaries. So I feel like, and I know this is the case in Canada and in Australia, I was brought out really because the staff was like, we want ideas, we want things to happen, like rabble-rouse, like go ahead. In fact, one of the questions somebody asked in Australia, they were upset after I spoke. They're like, well, what is the government going to do to sanction more of this guerrilla activities like he was talking about? And I was like, government sanctioned guerrilla activities? What is that?
The government sanctioned revolutionary?
That's right,
I was just in Guelph with Andrew, same thing. We did the Urban Design Conference, and it was, they had that same attitude, and I was just like, wow, this is different. How do you process this and make a policy to do this? But in the context of watching the whole entire conference, it all started to make sense for me. And there was this urban designer from Toronto that gets up and really proudly shows a drawing. This is the drawing we drew of the urban design and the fact of huge buildings, big public space, and then he follows it with a picture, and it's the exact same thing. It's just one's real and one's a drawing. And he's like, look at how close the real thing is what we drew, and I'm just like, wow, that's pretty crazy. But it's just this total different engaged mindset. And then I think what happens is the community gets complacent in that they're just like, well, they're going to solve the problem or whatever. But there's still entrepreneurial activity. It's just not as crazy, and I think that's maybe just a cultural thing that we're a much more engaged country that way. That we are a full contact community. People yell at you at a meeting.
I think a lot of places are successful neighborhoods. We've worked in Somerville, and Davis Square is like this incredible, transit oriented on this red line neighborhood that has really become this great neighborhood over the last, say, 30 years, larger than the last 15. And for them, it's not so much like there's little tweaks around small parking lots that can become buildings and things like that. It's already a great place, but it's about getting the process right and the engagement right. So what they're finding is that they don't want any of those little parking lots to become buildings, because the neighborhood doesn't want the change now.
Right.
So in those places, it is about innovation in process, not about innovation in urbanism, because they got the urbanism already. How do you get them to plug back in, or to show there's a wider voice of people who do want more of that infill development, more affordable housing, more things like that.
That's where
in those places.
That's where the Fab Lab movement, I think, really excites me. That's have you seen the Fab Labs?
No, I haven't.
So Fab Labs are basically people taking these warehouses and making fabrication laboratories.
Okay.
So imagine your library is changing to these resource centers with 3D printers, CNC routers. The kids in school know SketchUp and all these tools, so they can go in. Yeah, they're free, and you can go in, and this is what my dream is, that we have our students going in and fixing their environments around them, like giving them a few kind of basic tenets of what we've talked about, and saying, here, go ahead and take a weekend and build a couple of these things out. You've seen with CNC routers, so I mean, we're just now starting to using one project, but Tommy talked about they take one sheet of plywood and he can make 8 legs for chairs real fast, cut them out, and they have teams assembling them. He said in 2 days they had 80 chairs.
40 chairs.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just kind of instant kind of beer garden, basically.
Right. That's like 4x what we can deliver just with our normal methodologies of pallet to chair.
Yeah. So, and that's, a great education tool for the community. This is what Mike and I've talked a little bit about too. It's what's been fun for me now through the success of like the TED Talk and other things that I had going on was that I'm getting put in front of audiences that aren't urbanists now, and architects, and you probably are as well.
Yeah.
And it's so fun because they get so excited about what's going on. Like, you guys are just doing this stuff, and what is this? What is walkability and form? What are you talking about? So I'm talking to like kids at drug prevention groups in Washington, and then facility management associations in DC, and I'm kind of just I'm changing my message a bit, kind of talking about how you can use this idea of instant activation to ideate a bit, but it's also relaying the message of this overall, we need to fix our places together, and they're all coming back becoming kind of urbanists, after these presentations. So it's been great.
Well, to me, that's the thing about what you two do. That is just incredible. Yeah, we're just in awe of it.
Well, and also I think that when you talk about the audiences, I think that people get excited with you guys. They tend to get their minds melted with they kind of stun them a little bit. They're just like, whoa, wait a minute, what the hell just happened?
And
I mean, I see in presentations where I literally have to stop because I'm looking in the audience and they're just jogging.
You went too far.
Oh yeah, I was in Australia and I was presenting, and I was presenting with all of these kind of architects and people studying sociology, PhDs, and I feel like, oh gosh, I'm the idiot in the room. I'm totally, no one's gonna like listen to me. But people were falling asleep because they saw all these PowerPoints with just nothing but numbers and bullet points and things like that, which is fine. You can have a few of those, but people can really get fatigued fast. They want, I mean, like you saw the reason you kind of started this effort. Like, people were asking you, like, what's the solution? Chuck, you depressed us.
Exactly.
we all want to go. What do we do? And so you're like, there are people trying to fix things here. And that's what we found even with our work. It's like, we don't know what the solution is, but here's a little thing we found. Something's happening.
I think so much thinking about growing up in education, and there was still some like industrial design, education available at my high school. But that was like, if you were a kid who was like maybe not going to college, you were routed there.
You would have shop. Well, we called it shop class.
Right. So shop class, I feel like I can't believe I didn't take shop class, because the only reason that I have any skills to do anything that we do in our projects is because I was on a construction crew for about 3 summers, in college.
So I grew up on a farm, and then like you learn to do all that stuff, but you go hang out like, no, I don't.
But if you grow up at other places, suburbia or cities, like you don't get the skill set anymore. They've cut those kinds of classes and programs, and even if you had them, maybe you didn't take them growing up.
Well, the amazing is that we do have, in my neighborhood, the shop classes we have are auto shop classes. So that's what our next idea is, like, how do we use the auto shop classes to like start, using the same tools to start fixing the environment? So because we're still focusing now.
You're talking about fixing cars.
Fixing cars.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
We had at my high school the shop class where they would build the suburban ranch house and the garage, and then move that out to someone's place. Yeah, I would love to like repurpose that to build like good houses that could be added on to over time, that we could put on some of the vacant lots in town.
And that's why this Fab Lab movement the maker movement is so exciting, because it's not going to grip 8% of kids who are under 20 right now, but if you get 10% of them keyed into this, like that could be really impactful. Then go apply those skill sets to communities as opposed to fixing cars.
Yeah, just drop off a shipping container in these auto shop classes like a fab lab. Just like, hey, go ahead and fix it, do it, and then we'll drop it off and edge it on the street and watch. Let's put a pop-up business and just kind of see what happens with this as well. Right. So I think we're on the edge of seeing that happen. I know in our projects we're actually getting there by default because we. Mike and I had the Somerville project, and we have an Atlanta project coming up, but we've started rolling out classes now for people because just out of necessity, because I was like, how do I get these things done? I need for this block, I need parklets, I need benches, I need these. It's like, if I do a class, people can come in, they can build these things for me, they can put it out in the street, but I need people to pick it up too and say, hey, the next day, take your chair home with you.
Right. So, well, also learn the skills so that you're building capacity in the community that you work with. You're not just doing it there. It actually people learn these skill sets to do it later as well.
There are community colleges doing that. There are places that do that. They tend to focus on the human resource, and I think that's a brilliant idea because it focuses on a physical resource as well. Right. Like the community college in Asheville, in our county, they have this incredible culinary and beer program. So the result of that is we have
great restaurants,
16 breweries and 70 restaurants downtown. It's unbelievable for a town of 80,000 people. Right. Because as an entrepreneur, you can go and find talent that can actually make good food. Yeah. So, I realize that when I leave my community and go someplace else, and I'm like, what do you mean you don't have breweries here? What do you mean you don't have restaurants?
Right.
But creating that, starting with that human resource, but then coupling that with a physical resource as well.
Those pieces together.
Well, I also wonder too, though, is there, maybe the open source movement is the opportunity here, but it's like the Dunkin' Donuts model. 90% of these chains basically have this back end stuff. Right. That's what you're paying for. It's like kind of the automation of like the POS systems, getting the deliveries there and all. Why haven't we? I mean, maybe that's the future is the shared economy or figuring this out to automate the 90% of the stuff that everybody doesn't do well because they want to do the stuff they love. They want to create the food.
Right.
And so is that the next movement? Or
it's interesting because the economic gardening model is focused a lot on that. You're an entrepreneur, and it's a little bit bigger. They wouldn't get into the donut shop, but they would get into the kind of the fast-growing, maybe like the tech business. And what they've realized is that the people who are creating the most jobs, the people who are in these innovative places, the people that are exporting things out of the community and importing capital that then can get passed around, the problems that they have growing jobs are not how do we do what we're good at and passionate at. It's how do we do HR? How do we do market research? How do we identify where we can sell our products and what our competitors are doing? Those are the things that actually for a local government are fairly easy to do if you can get someone with those skill sets in, and you can benefit businesses all over the place and let them focus on the key things that they need to do.
So there could be a huge market for that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, you wonder why Chambers of Commerce don't take on that more. Like, we'll help run your back end for you.
I really feel like I think the chambers could. I really feel like the Main Street program, there's a niche for them there. They've really been, the Main Street program has historically been about kind of pushing back on the malls. We got malls, and so we're going to have a downtown, and we'll have festivals and different things to get people downtown. Right. Well, the whole mall thing is on the decline. That is a beast that's been slayed in a sense. And I think like a repurposed Main Street organization, because it's not economic gardening. Economic gardening is working with these stage 2 companies, these exporters. But there's a need to come in and help the person who wants to open the burrito place.
Right.
How do you?
Well, look what we found out.
How do you get that started? And it's not like SBA. It's not like the community college teaching you a 101 accounting class. It's literally like, how do we free you up
to do this? That's what they figured out with MemShop. And Tommy told us about this morning is that literally the barrier between small entrepreneurs and vacant buildings was about $5,000.
Right.
You give that sort of leniency or grant or break to the entrepreneur, get them to set up, get them inside, and then you give them the back end skills of basic training and marketing and pricing and those sorts of pieces. Yeah. It's incredible that they had 15 and then 7 of them stayed, and some of them have grown and actually moved out of those spaces and they've been so successful. Yeah, we can get a 50% retention rate on that kind of stuff for $5,000 a business. That's incredible.
Yeah, we kind of end up working backwards a little bit into the same kind of idea where we find the chef in the community and we say, as volunteers, we will help you create create your dishes, and we'll see if we can kind of create all the other steps you need in between for the 2 days.
Right,
so Same kind of idea. And then once they kind of figure out like, oh, I've got my nice systems in place. This is so nice. I can make this permanent. Honestly, that's the barrier to entry for a lot of these folks. It's just like the processes they have to put in place are so burdensome.
The company I used to work with, Public Interest Projects, that was their model. Was essentially provide the business apparatus for the small entrepreneurs that handle the books, look at the trending of your information. If you've got a question about accounting or law or rent or whatever, they were there because they had multiple businesses and properties to work with the entrepreneur on that. But that model could be easily translated into a small town or city's economic development department, a Main Street program. It's not complex.
Companies like Airbnb have figured that out. There's no way I want to be in the innkeeping business of dealing with all those logistics.
Deal with transactions, deal with
my goodness, it's still a lot of work to do the Airbnb management thing, but we're doing it in my house, and we reap thousands of dollars of benefits because someone figured out this platform that we could just use. So we're gone for the weekend. It's like,
we need to get rid of that. Let me ask a wrap-up question. How much optimism do you have versus pessimism? And I know, the four of us tend to be optimistic people, but also run into a lot of burdens all the time, a lot of obstacles. 5 years from now, cities in a better place, still struggling. What level of optimism do you have?
I'm optimistic. I think that things are changing. I think the millennial movement is driving a lot of things. And you're seeing this in the consumer marketplace. The people, if the Chipotle does come in, people will vote with their feet. There'll be a class that comes in that follows that, but there'll be a class that moves to a different restaurant or something. So you see this in lots of places. It's a dynamic, evolving thing. And it's just a growing pain that I think we're going to have to all go through with that process, that people aren't going to magically fall in love with cities again. There's a reason why they made those choices. And we've kind of embedded that and rewarded that cultural decision financially with large government investments.
Right.
So it's just a matter of going through the temper tantrum and watching and riding it out. And I think it's going to be peaks and valleys through this whole thing.
Yeah.
I'm split in half. I've got optimism on the sense that I think the forum is going to start looking more the way we want it to, just out of necessity, like the conversation I had with the city manager. And so we'll get some things like that. Where I'm pessimistic is I don't see the level of community engagement or ownership like our grandparents' generation had, the whole bowling alone scenario we're dealing with.
Right.
And you see that with voter turnout and things like that. It's still staying at these dramatically low levels, and that's ultimately sad to know that 100 years ago we had Kiwanis clubs and Oddfellows and Masons and things that had their own parades and helped build orphanages and Shriners doing hospitals, and that isn't coming back, it doesn't seem like. And I know Robert Putnam's theory there was on television and air conditioning, and maybe that's what it is, but I wish, we're definitely, I think some of these processes and maybe the Fab Labs and the work we're doing is hopefully building up a little bit, but I'm just not seeing the levels I wished.
And you should do a little parade at each community, like a Shriners event, get a little fezzes and Andreas and a little go-kart. That'd be awesome.
I would just have to say I'm mostly just an optimistic person, and I see a lot of change happening. Every time I go to a community, there's something innovative, creative, interesting happening, no matter where that is, and I get really inspired by that. So I'm seeing that at that small scale. But I also see that the benefit of those things happening right now are benefiting still just a few, right? And so there's a lot of things that people are tapping into and scaling up that are beneficial still for a few. So I'm seeing this still the divergence of our culture, and whether that's being disenfranchised, not voting, or is this the challenge with the politics, and just having these two polar sides of the two camps. It's like very difficult to overcome that. And I also see, back to the Great Inversion, if I can wrap this up that way, is that we're completely unprepared to put people who have the least resources out on the edge as a culture.
Totally.
If you go and you throw people who have least resources, 30 miles from downtown, it's over. You know what? You know what that looks like? That looks like Detroit. Yeah. Because everything left Detroit and all the poor people were left in the core of the city, right? And then to get from, if you lived in the city of Detroit, to get to where the jobs are in the suburbs, oh my goodness, unbelievably difficult, expensive, and ultimately not possible for a lot of people.
Right.
We're seeing that now slowly starting to play out, but now in reverse. And so now we're putting people, at least Detroit has a bus system. Skeleton, but it has a bus system.
Right.
A lot of the outlying suburban, exurban areas where there's going to be cheap real estate, they don't have those resources. Doesn't mean they can't, but we've already set them up for failure to make those kinds of systems work. So we don't have the density, don't have the connectivity, and the infrastructure is going to be so damn expensive to maintain and continue that we can't afford those other things when the people are going to need it.
I feel like the challenge of our generation is to make sure that we don't leave those people behind as this changes. And you can look back at white flight and the way we were, the way our society kind of evolved then in the 20 years and the convulsions that things went through because of the inequities. I do think that the challenge that we face as this whole thing shakes out is that it doesn't empower a select few, but that we're able to do it and not leave people behind. And I think that is, if I'm optimistic that change is coming, I'm pessimistic or I'm worried.
Concerned, yeah.
I'm concerned that we're not up to that challenge.
All right.
That's a positive.
I'll take it.
Thanks, guys.